Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, where we explore the big stories and current trends in our region. My name is Amran Zaman, and today I'll be taking a deep dive into international sanctions that continue to cripple Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. I've just returned from a reporting trip to Syria, and I saw the impact of sanctions firsthand. The country remains in ruins. People are crushed by poverty. And for as long as US congressional restrictions on Syria that keep international investors at bay remain in place, little can change. With me here to discuss this highly complex landscape is Vittorio Maresca di Serracapriola. Vittorio is the lead sanctions analyst at Karam Shaar Advisory, a consultancy that focuses on Syria and which, in my experience, provides some of the finest economic reporting on the subject. So welcome to our program, Vittorio. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you very much, Amber.
So we're going to be talking about sanctions on Syria, and it's very complicated because you have a set of sanctions that were imposed on the Assad regime, and then you have a different set that were imposed on Hayat Tahrir Sham, the group which was led by Syria's current interim president. And so what we want from you is to unpack all of that for us, to explain to us what the status is currently with those sanctions, what is still pending, and why it's so important that whatever is pending, and then of course I'm referring specifically to Caesar, why it's so vital that those also be lifted if Syria is to move forward. It's a lot, but let's just start with the first part.
Absolutely, with great pleasure. So I think it's important to remind the audience that Syria hasn't been sanctioned just since 2011, but the US was the first state to put sanctions on Syria back in 1979. So Syria has been under sanctions since basically almost 50 years. And at first was put under the state sponsorship of terrorism designation, which is one of the remaining sanctions right now. And it was put under that designation at the time because of its support of Palestinian armed groups. Nowadays, Syria is facing a set of sanctions. You've mentioned the Caesar Act, but there's also other acts, for instance, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, but also a series of executive orders that are targeting the former Assad regime and other affiliates of the regime. And you also have got a series of other sanctions affecting the country. So that's with regards to US sanctions. Then you had EU sanctions, which were placed in 2011 after the uprisings and the violent repression of the uprisings by the Assad regime, which started with some targeted sanctions focused on specific individuals and then were extended to a broader set of targets, including economic sectors. So in jargon, we talk about sectoral sanctions, and these targeted banks, but also the oil and gas sector or the agriculture sector. The aim of these sanctions was to, let's say, there was first an accountability aim, so to render the regime accountable, and second, there was a policy aim, which was to inhibit the regime in its repression and try to, let's say, weaken it. And of course, the US also imposed sanctions back in 2011 because of the repression. And a lot of these sanctions have been removed following Trump's statement in May 2025 regarding the cessation of sanctions. But a lot of these sanctions have been also transformed into new regimes that do not necessarily focus on Syria as a territorial entity, but mostly focus on simply the Assad regime. And then you've got UN sanctions. There's a lot of talk about UN sanctions right now because there has been reportedly a draft resolution that has been introduced in the UN Security Council by the US. And these sanctions fall under what is called the 1267 regime, which is a regime that was created initially to target the Al-Qaeda threat, but then extended to ISIS. And under this regime, you've got Ashara, but also Khattab and other Hayat Tahrir al-Sham members being sanctioned.
Anas Khattab, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, being the Minister of Interior. So
Correct.
this big web of sanctions, many were removed by the European Union and also by Donald Trump, as you mentioned, after his landmark meeting with Shara in Riyadh in May. But among those outstanding, can you please tell our audience what is the most important set of sanctions that basically is a kind of chokehold on Syria, preventing it from moving forward, from embarking on the path of economic, I would say, humanitarian recovery?
Well, Um, I'm just reporting here conversations I've had with foreign banks and in general private sector actors. And when they're talking about Syria, when they're talking about re-engagement, now that most of the sanctions have been removed, what often is mentioned is the Caesar Act, which is a set of sanctions that was passed in Congress in 2019 and was imposed in 2020 and basically targeted the Assad regime and had as one of its main aim to impede the reconstruction of Syria while Assad was there. So these sanctions are very peculiar because they basically impose they are called, again in jargon, secondary sanctions, which basically mean that they do not only target US companies trading with Syria, but they also target non-US companies. So they have a sort of extraterritorial dimension to it. They just don't apply to the US. The caveat here is that we know that in general, US sanctions always have some kind of extraterritorial dimension because the moment you touch a US dollar, you fall under US jurisdiction. And because the US dollar is the main currency that is being used in international trade and finance, that's why US sanctions have such a broad effect. But again, it's important to emphasize that the Caesar Act, let's say, puts it into text, this secondary effect of sanctions, and basically targets any non-US company and entity doing trade with Syria.
And foreign banks, including Gulf banks, which trade in dollars and who are, obviously very eager, at least the governments, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, to invest in Syria and to help rebuild that country, but cannot, or rather choose not to, because they are too, exposed to the risks that you described, and things could get really complicated for them until there's a full repeal.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, Our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Now, we know there are moves in the United States Congress for a full repeal. Can you give us an update on what's happening on that front?
Sure. So basically, what happened is that on the 9th of October 2025, the US Senate passed the NDAA, which is the National Defense and Authorization Act, and which basically is a defense bill and is often referred to as a must-pass bill. And this bill includes several foreign policy provisions, and among them you have two amendments which concern the Caesar Act, and these are Amendment 3662, which was introduced by Senator Shaheen, who's a Democrat from New Hampshire, and she calls for a full repeal of the Caesar Act.
And she's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right?
Exactly,
And she
exactly.
was in Damascus. She met with Shara, and she made it pretty clear that she thought he wasn't such a bad guy, and that she felt that these sanctions should be repealed if Syria is to have a chance. That was kind of her position, right?
Indeed, it was the first formal US delegation to visit Syria since at least 14 years, and she went there with Representative Joe Wilson, who is a Republican and who also tried to attach an amendment in the House pushing for a repeal of the Caesar Act. Both the senator and the representative, they both have separate bills which tried to push for a full repeal of the Caesar Act. But these bills have been introduced in Congress, but they sort of stagnated, or although Joe Wilson bill managed to gather at least 15 co-sponsors. But I think it was a sort of a stratagem, a shrewd thing to do for them to attach the repeal language
Well, the
to
politics of it are pretty complicated. I must confess that I have difficulty grasping all the
same.
intricacies
I
of
do as
those
well.
shenanigans that go on in the Congress. But it's really the political view, rather will, that's reflected through those actions that matter. But we also have a school of thought in the Congress that appears to be shifting, softening a bit, which basically argues that you need to remove the sanctions gradually in tandem with assessments of how this new government is behaving, and in particular treating its minorities, given especially some of the horrific violence that unfolded along the coast in March against the Alawites, and latterly in July against the Druze, and potentially against the Kurds, who we all know enjoy quite a bit of sympathy in the United States Congress, notably because of their valor against the Islamic State alongside US-led coalition forces.
Exactly. And regarding this school of, let's say, political school within Congress that you've mentioned, you've got Senator Lindsey Graham and also Senator Chris Van Hollen. So again, a bipartisan couple, let's say. One is Republican, the other one is a Democrat. And they also attached an amendment to the NDAA, which was initially drafted to suspend, so not repeal the Caesar Act, and it would replace the act with a new, let's say, conditional certification regime, whereby the President of the United States would have to report to Congress every 120 days on whether the Syrian conditions met a series of, on whether the Syrian government met a series of conditions, and these conditions included cooperation against ISIS, but also protection of minorities, as you mentioned, cessation of support for terrorist groups, withdrawal of foreign fighters from the Syrian government and security institutions, in general, a move toward a peaceful regional conduct, especially with regards to Israel. And finally, the last condition had to do with um, um, credible investigations into human rights abuses committed after December 2024. So we're talking mostly here about the March Lataiya massacres and also the Sueda clashes that have happened in July. So basically, this amendment uh, would include a repeal of the Caesar Act, but would formally create a post-repeal certification regime whereby the president would have to report to Congress on whether Syria is meeting these conditions.
Yeah, a very sort of laborious kind of process that again
Indeed.
makes things pretty complicated is for any kind of recovery to happen. Um, but you made the point, argument, and it's one that's made certainly by the government itself, that these sanctions, the Caesar Act, is not legal, in fact, because there is no Assad regime and it was crafted to punish, sanction the Assad regime.
I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not 100% sure about the legality of the act itself according to international law. But what is certain is that sanctions, especially as described by the US government on their website, always have a policy objective. Um, but the policy objective for these sanctions was targeting the Assad regime. The Assad regime is no longer there, so the rationale for them to be there is also gone. So that's what I was referring to before.
Okay, so I'm sorry if I misunderstood what you were saying. You weren't making a legal
Oh.
pronouncement because, as you say, you're not an international lawyer. You're a sanctions expert. But zooming out a bit from, the whole sort of details of these sanctions, etc. I mean, do sanctions actually deliver?
Well, I mean, we can say that they delivered amazingly somehow in terms of inhibiting the Assad regime and leading to the fall of the regime in December 2024. Although, again, this is a matter of causality, and it's hard to establish to what extent these sanctions were the main cause for the regime fall, especially within a complex system like Syria. There are so many variables that played a role in that case. So yes, sanction delivered on their purpose. Then the question now is to what extent is there a sanction, let's call it hangover? To what extent sanctions can also, when put in place, undeliver, let's say, and create hurdles, create problems for the country to, stand back on its feet, and sometimes actually can be counterproductive, especially with regards to some of the policy objectives of these countries initially placing sanctions, whether it be about combating terrorism or illegal migration. Because one of the preconditions for a country that was formally sanctioned or is sanctioned for, let's say, for it to, be reconnected with the global financial system or in general catch up with the countries that are not sanctioned is obviously for sanction to be removed. And we haven't seen that to the full extent in the case of Syria.
Though I think we can all agree that the United States Syria envoy, Ambassador Tom Barrack, seems to believe that there should be a full repeal. He's actively lobbying for that. And I think part of his effort to bring the Kurds and the transitional government in Damascus together and push for an agreement is also linked to that effort, because I think, well, if the United States Congress saw a real deal, with real substance being agreed between those sides, it would perhaps give them further impetus for a full repeal. Well, we'll see what happens, because the negotiations are continuing between the Kurds and Damascus, and they're sort of under immense pressure to deliver. Thank you so much for joining us here today, Vittorio. It was very interesting, always interesting to talk to you, and hope to have you again on our podcast.
Thank you so much, Amberin, for hosting me, and really looking forward to being on your podcast in the future again.
And this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. To read my stories from Syria and much, much more, go to our website www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.